Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to rise today to speak to Bill C-10, the Safe Streets and Communities Act. Honourable members will know that over 5 years ago, our government made a promise to Canadians. We pledged to keep them safe and secure. Ce projet de loi va continuer le
This bill builds on the work our government has already undertaken to more fully hold offenders to account for their actions and to stand up for victims.
It's always been central to our government's crime reduction agenda. And with that in mind, I'd like to devote my remarks today to discussing a very important component of Bill C-10, which deals with victims of terrorism. Monsieur le Président,
Mr. Speaker, the threat of terrorism is a reality for Canadians. It is not a distant concept or something that only happens in far corners of the globe.
Terrorism can happen and has happened right here on our soil, and Canadians can be and are also targeted by terrorist organizations when they are living, working, and traveling in other countries. Since September 2001, fully 195 Canadians have fallen victim to terrorism. This year, on the 10th anniversary of the September 11th attacks, we remember the 24 Canadians killed that brutal morning. In 2002, 2 Canadians were killed in the Bali bombings. Another individual killed by terrorists in Indonesia that day was my friend Peter Record, a 32-year-old British citizen. Peter was like any typical Canadian. He liked the outdoors, he enjoyed a pint of ale, but instead of hockey, was a big rugby fan. Peter and I worked together in Hong Kong, and on that tragic day in 2002, he was vacationing in Bali when he was killed by a bomb. For me, this is a striking reminder that a terrorist attack isn't something that only happens to the friends and families of others. Indeed, this is a global threat, and Canada must do its part to protect its citizens. In 2003, a year later, 2 Canadians were killed in the bombing of the United Nations headquarters in Baghdad. A Canadian diplomat was killed in Afghanistan in 2006 in an attack on a Canadian convoy. 2 years later, in 2008, 4 Canadians were killed and injured in the Bombay attacks, and another 2 Canadian aid workers were ambushed and killed by the Taliban in Afghanistan.
In 2009, an explosion in Kandahar City claimed the life of a Canadian journalist. More recently, in 2011, 2 Canadian citizens were killed in a cafe attack in Morocco. 157 members of the Canadian forces have been killed combating terrorism while serving in the Afghanistan mission.
Terrorism continues to threaten the lives of innocent citizens in Canada and around the world. A number of international and domestic extremist groups are present in Canada. Some engage in terrorist activities here or support terrorism beyond Canada's borders. Some have worked to manipulate or coerce members of Canadian society into advancing extremist causes hostile to our nation and our nation's values. Terrorism is a serious and persistent threat to the security of Canada and its citizens.
This government is committed to protecting Canada from terrorism and keeping its citizens safe in their homes and communities. Ensuring the safety and security of all Canadians is a commitment our government takes seriously.
The bill before us today is another important initiative to strengthen our country's national security network. Bill C-10 would complement our existing counter-terrorism measures by deterring terrorism, responding to the needs of victims of terrorism, and demonstrating Canada's leadership in acting against the perpetrators and supporters of terrorism around the world. Indeed, Bill C-10 would constitute another important instrument in our efforts to deter this global threat. I'd like to take this opportunity to provide you with an overview of the provisions contained in Bill C-10, which pertain to victims of terrorism, and explain how our government proposes to respond to their needs. Mr. Speaker, to achieve these goals, Bill C-10 will allow victims of terrorism to sue in a Canadian court perpetrators of terrorist acts and their supporters, provided the victims can demonstrate a real and substantial connection between their actions in Canada. Specifically, Bill C-10 would allow victims of terrorism to file a court case against perpetrators of terror. Such a terrorist entity listed under the Criminal Code or other persons or organizations that carried out a terrorist attack. In addition, a legal case could be brought against individuals, entities, or listed states which provided support to a terrorist entity. If the loss or damage occurs outside Canada, there must be a real and substantial connection to this country. This legislation would be retroactive to January the 1st, 1985, in order to allow victims of terrorism to seek redress for loss and damage that occurred as a result of a terrorist act committed anywhere in the world on or after that date. Allowing victims of terrorism to sue for past events will send a message to perpetrators and supporters of terror that Canada will hold them liable for their actions. To allow for legal action against listed states, Bill C-10 will amend the State Immunity Act to lift the immunity of states who are supporters of terrorism. Lifting a state's immunity is a decision that cannot be taken lightly, as it may have significant impacts on Canada's international relations, interests, and foreign policy. This bill creates a robust mechanism for determining whether a foreign state should be listed as a supporter of terrorism. The Governor and Council, on the recommendation of the Minister of Foreign Affairs in consultation with the Minister of Public Safety, will be able to add a state to the list if there are reasonable grounds to believe that the state supports or has supported a terrorist entity listed under the Criminal Code. Mr. Speaker, using the list of terrorist entities under the Criminal Code is an adequate criterion to justify the listing of a foreign state, since the Criminal Code list is determined through a rigorous analytical process. There are currently 44 listed entities. Let me assure you that the government will take all the appropriate precautions to minimize any potential negative impact on Canadian trade or foreign relations, or threats to Canadian personnel, interests, and citizens abroad when listing and delisting states. Bill C-10 will also establish a review mechanism to ensure the timely removal of states from the list if they are determined to no longer support terrorism. Here, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, in consultation with the Minister of Public Safety, will review the list every 2 years to determine whether a state should remain on the list and whether other countries should be added to the list. Also, a listed state could apply to be removed by submitting a written application to this effect. Once this application is received, the Ministers of Foreign Affairs and Public Safety would decide whether there were reasonable grounds to recommend to the Governor and Council that the state no longer be listed. Mr. Speaker, Bill C-10 does more than just create a cause of legal action for victims of terrorism. It would also allow plaintiffs who have received a judgment in their favor to request assistance from the Minister of Foreign Affairs and the Minister of Finance in identifying and locating in Canada the property of a foreign state against which a judgment has been rendered. Such assistance would have to fall within those ministers' mandates and would be provided to the extent reasonably practical, unless doing so would be detrimental to Canada's interest. These provisions will strike a balance to allow the Government of Canada to help victims in real and tangible ways while safeguarding Canada's standing in the international community. Finally, Bill C-10 also calls for the recognition of foreign judgments by Canadian courts in favour of victims of terrorism. In conclusion, Mr. Speaker, Bill C-10 is yet another indication of our determination to give victims not only a voice, but legal means to seek justice against those who cause them harm. This is the latest tool in our growing arsenal to deal with the threats to the safety of Canadians, both here at home and abroad. I urge all honourable members to support Bill C-10 in order to provide justice for victims and punishment for terrorists, perpetrators, and supporters of terrorism. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and commentaires?
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Rimouski-Neigette, Témiscouata-les-Basques.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to thank my colleague for his speech, but I have a specific question, given the work he has done as the president of the Taxpayers Foundation. In C-10, one of the main problems is that we don't know how much it's going to cost. We know that there will be costs, especially with the mandatory minimums for both the federal and provincial governments. So I would like to know if the honourable member can give us an idea of how much the provincial and federal governments will have to pay to implement this, and whether we can get an answer to this.
I think your question doesn't really address the issues that I've raised today. Let me touch on it nonetheless. It's clear there's a cost to society when crime is allowed to happen and is not deterred. Our government is simply taking steps to reduce crime in this country, thereby saving society money. Having said that as well, I'll echo the comments from the Minister of Justice earlier today. I do find that ironic that the only time the official opposition seems to be concerned about spending initiatives is when it comes to the protection and safety of Canadians. And regarding this aspect of Bill C-10, this is a measure that gives rights to the victims of terrorism for themselves to seek help or the courts redress in the courts. So this is not an area that's going to end up costing the Government of Canada huge sums of money. We're acting to facilitate victims of terrorism so they can seek justice in our courts at home for what happens here or around the world. Thank you.
Questions et commentaires?
Questions and comments?
For Markham Unionville.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I congratulate the member for his speech. My question is in a similar vein to the previous one. I'm addressing him as an economist. I know he's an economist. Not only is he an economist, but he also used to work for an organization which took every opportunity to be against higher government spending in favor of lower taxes. So this bill involves higher government spending, but not the usual kind that is explicit and honestly stated, but hidden government spending. Because here we have a situation where it may be $3 billion, it may be $10 billion, it may be whatever numbers of billions of additional expenditures on prisons, and the government refuses to give us any idea of what that additional cost is. So my question is, and I have nothing against most of what he said in terms of the ability of victims of terrorism to sue, that doesn't even cost much money, but the overall bill costs an unknown number of billions of dollars, possibly ranging into tens of billions. So one might like something if it costs $1 billion, but not like it if it costs $12 billion. So how can you possibly justify the government giving no information to Canadians on the cost of this legislation?
Well, member for New Brunswick Southwest.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A couple points there. The group I used to work for, the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, was primarily opposed to wasteful government spending, which is an altogether different thing than government spending. And on that note, I think the member is valid. For example, that the long gun registry sounded like a great idea when we were told it would cost $2 million, but when the price tag hit $2 billion, suddenly Canadians no longer agreed with it. So the member is correct. Governments can waste money and often do. But look, again, when it comes to this bill, documents were tabled, which outline some of the costs. But as well, we also want to step back here. Even the Minister of Public Safety has pointed out in the media that his own department thought some of the provisions we'd enacted would increase the prison population to 16,000, when in fact it had gone to 14,800. What we're seeing here is, by getting tough on crime, it's the repeat offenders that are serving in jail longer, as opposed to us locking up more and more Canadians, which seems to be a concern of the opposition. So look, this is a reasonable bill which addresses the concerns of Canadians. Yes, there's a cost to it, but there's a greater cost to society when government sits back and allows crime to happen without being punished. Thank you.
Here.